we've discussed the three elements, the aperture, the speed and the ISO. So now we're going to take a portrait, and as photographers, that's what we love doing. You know, all this technical stuff is pretty boring, but you've got to know it. But once you know it, then you can enjoy it and just relax and take the images. I'm going to shoot this one at 1.4 to explain the depth of field. This is my daughter Claire, by the way, who's helping us out today. Okay, now 1.4 gives you a very narrow depth of field. Possibly just the eyes only are going to be sharp. And I'm using aperture priority, and I've set my aperture at 1.4. So I've got control over the camera, but I haven't got control over the shutter speed. So what I've done, I've increased the ISO to 1000, and that's given me a 400 shutter speed, so 400th of a second. So I can comfortably handhold the camera, and I've got complete control. And it's nice to be able to do that, because if you're using a tripod, then you can't have those little movements that you want to use just to frame and compose the image. It's just too slow with a tripod. So now what we're going to do is discuss the lighting setup that I've used. I like using natural light. The light source that I use is window. It's facing east, so I've got a constant light source from around about 10:30 in the day all the way through to about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening. So it's quite constant unless the light changes and clouds come through, and then all I do is increase my ISO. Now I'm using a reflector to balance the light. So what the reflector does, the reflector helps me fill the shadow. So for instance, the light source is coming through here and catching the right-hand side of Claire's face, and just catching that other corner, and the reflector is balancing that, so it's pushing the light back just to fill the shadows. If we take the reflector away, we're going to get a very contrasty portrait, so it's going to be quite dark on one side and quite light on the other. Now shooting at 1.4, I've got a very shallow depth of field, so in this particular portrait we've got probably half an inch maybe of depth. So Claire's eyes will be sharp, but nose, ears, hair and the clothing that she's wearing is very, very soft. I like shooting at 1.4. But now we're going to shoot at f2.8 just to show you the difference between 1.4 and 2.8. So at 2.8 I've got from Claire's nose back to the ears, so I've got about that much depth of field, so it's a lot sharper, and but it decreases the shutter speed. So I've gone from 400 shutter speed down to probably 200. Okay, so because this is over nearly 2 stops from 1.4 to 2.8, so probably a little bit less than that. So there we've got to be careful now. So if we want to go to the next level, which is 5.6, which I'm going to do next, then what we have to do is increase the ISO. So 5.6, I'm going to increase the ISO to 2000, which I've done, and we're going to take a picture now at 5.6. Now the shutter speed is getting lower. That was a 60th at 5.6, so it's just pushing the boundaries. But at 5.6 I've got total depth of field between the tip of the nose and the back of Claire's hair. So I'm increasing my depth of field, and the picture is becoming sharper. Now for portraiture, that's not as desirable to have an image sharp all the way through. I think for an individual portrait, the ideal aperture is probably around about f2, f2.8. I like shooting at 1.4, but I like them really soft. That's personal taste. At 5.6, what is good is you can do a family portrait. You can introduce people into the image. So you can bring somebody in here, and you can bring another person in here, and you've got the depth of field to create a portrait of 3 people. We've still got that constant light source, so I can get 3 people into this image now because I'm shooting at 5.6. That's what that depth of field helps me with, is bringing in more people into a portrait. So for a family group shot, I might shoot that at f8. So let's just do one at f8, just to show you how that sharpness works. So what we're going to do is set the aperture to f8. So now I've got to increase my ISO because I need more light. So we're going to make that ISO a little bit more sensitive. So 3200 for the ISO, and at f8, shutter speed slow down. even though I've increased the ISO, I'm still at a 60th of a second. So now at f8, I've got complete depth of field. I've probably got about 2 foot of depth of field, which is ideal for a family portrait, but not so good for an individual portrait. We don't want everything sharp when we're doing a portrait. We don't want everything all the way through the clothing. It becomes a distraction, the background becomes sharper. So for an individual, I would suggest anywhere between f2 and f2.8. So that's how the depth of field works between the 1.4 and the f8. And obviously I haven't spoke about all the increments in between, but you can play with that and work that one through. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this little lesson on portrait lighting. Thanks Claire for being our model for the afternoon, and we'll move on to another topic.